gentle humorist Sandip Roy, and thank you for starting the recording, and I am so excited to welcome Sandip Roy live from Kolkata, India. This is also our first truly global API Heritage Month Zoom event. We have a whole calendar coming up, and you can find that at foothill.edu. Just search API, Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, for the full week. But rather than do a long intro, I want to hurry up and say, Sandip Roy, welcome to API Heritage Month at Foothill College. Yay! There we go. And Sandip, I just want to plunge in right away since we are here for API Heritage Month. The first question I want to ask you is, how do you, from your perspective, see South Asians as fitting into this huge global patchwork of hundreds of languages and dozens of cultures and dozens of nations that make up the API, the Asian Pacific Islander heritage region of the world, as well as the vast diaspora? How do you see this fitting in or not to the topics that we're addressing?
Thanks, first of all, Scott, for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be back at Foothill, if not physically, at least virtually and I dressed up for the occasion too. I think this is the first time since the beginning of India going to lockdown that I'm actually wearing a shirt. So I've been in these ratty t-shirts for the last 2 weeks. So it gave me an excuse to dress up, at least the top half. But in terms of your question, it's interesting. When I grew up in Kolkata, and when you're in Kolkata, you don't even think of yourself as Kolkatan. You think of yourself as being from a very specific neighborhood in Kolkata. You know, you might be a South Kolkatan or a North Kolkatan, and never the twain shall meet. And it seemed like with every airplane, so to be honest, growing up in Kolkata, I never considered myself as part of any Asian diaspora, any API, anything alphabet soup at all. But it seemed like with every airplane I took on my journey from Kolkata to the United States, with every airplane I took, my label started increasing. So, you know, from Kolkatan, I became a Bengali. From Bengali, I became Indian. From Indian, I became South Asian. And then finally, in America, I became API. And one of the reasons one became API was at that time in America, there was no box on any of the forms that said South Asian. So the only default box you could check was Asian, and or if you wanted to be the other. And so there, it was sort of by default you were thrust into the API box. But then later on, you discovered that especially living in California, that you live on really a Pacific.
Oops,
cutting out.
Screen free.
The other side of the Pacific than it was to the rest of America. I went to college in the middle of Illinois. And in Illinois and San Francisco, the connection between San Francisco and Vietnam, or San Francisco and Taiwan, was actually far stronger to me than the connection in some ways between San Francisco and Carbondale, Illinois. So I really lived in the Pacific Rim. So I started feeling part of this API heritage. And as a gay man, looking for community within San Francisco when I first came, it was actually the API community that welcomed you in, the Gay Asian Pacific Alliance. When the South Asians were too few to march in a pride parade in San Francisco, for example, they marched with the Asian groups. When South Asians were looking, South Asian women's groups would find sisterhood with other larger Asian groups. So they gave you a larger sense of community. Of course, on the flip side, there would be many occasions where people would say, oh, you're Asian? but you don't look Asian. So if you went to one of the Asian bars I remember one of the jokes was one of my roommates said, "Oh, if you want to go to, a gay bar in San Francisco or something, you would probably do better in a Latino bar than in an Asian bar because
Wow.
you look more brown skinned Latin, closer to that than you look to the typical image of an Asian." But I think in some ways, having South Asians taking part in API Heritage Month was both a welcoming home for South Asians, as well as it forced America to broaden the idea of what API meant.
Great answer, and it brings up all the complexities. I mean, there you are in the world's second largest nation, 1 billion people, dozens and dozens of languages and cultures. So I wanted to ask you next about yet another label that gets pinned on lately, and where you feel where are you with the quote unquote model minority label that gets added so often with South Asian immigrants, and makes it, again, there's one more layer of complexity to deal with. And of course, I'm doing the air quotes because I at least am aware that is both inaccurate and a burden of its own for those on whom it's pinned, I think. Does that make sense?
I should say, Scott, that I'm here right now in Calcutta, and I have to confess that when I was going to school here, I actually won a good conduct medal or two in school.
You
So
were the best little boy in India, Sandeep.
I am the model of the model minority, and luckily I'm at my family home right now, and luckily my mother has gone to bed. Otherwise, she might actually bring out the medal and show it to all of you. Um, but yeah, I mean, the model minority tag actually got added to South Asians when they went to America, and that was because they were regarded as being very good at college. That a large number of them had master's degrees. They were in white-collar jobs. Not to mention the fact that every damn year they were winning the spelling bee. I think last year all 6 finalists were South Asian. I have no idea. I've done an entire radio program trying to decipher the connection between South Asians and spelling bees, and I'm not sure I've gotten to the bottom of it. But actually, right there in the Bay Area, they have South Asian only spelling bee boot camps where
Wow.
where I've been to them, where it's a lot of South Asian kids who compete with each other to sort of practice their spelling bee skills in the hopes of finally getting to the script spelling bee. And it goes generationally, like somebody's brother went into the finals, and so he is also expected to be a spelling bee champ later. And I asked one of the losers what he learned, and he said, "Oh, I learned a lot of words, but I didn't learn how to lose," which I thought was rather poignant. The pressure was so intense on these kids. But I think part of the model minority, I think we have to unpack that a little bit, is that South Asians for the longest time, and since this is API Heritage Month, South Asians for the longest time America. They were not allowed to. They were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to immigrate to America. So in 1965, when the immigration ban was lifted, it was basically the cream of South Asians from India, the ones who had graduate degrees, the ones who had studied engineering, all of them those people who went to the United States. So in a sense, it was a self-selected group of people who would have been high achievers in India who ended up going to America, and therefore they were went to MIT or Pasadena or UCLA or Foothill College or wherever, all these places. And so in a sense, they were already well qualified, educated, professional, and so were able to get ahead in America faster and lead to the model minority thing where professionals working in Silicon Valley and all of that. But I think the model minority label also works deeply against South Asians because it makes so many other South Asians fall within the radar. I mean, when you go to a place like the Bay Area, you can walk into a Dunkin' Donuts, you can walk into a gas station, and you will see South Asians working there. In fact, what many people did not realize is that at one time, where everybody would talk about the undocumented as being people from Mexico or Latin America, that South Asians were one of the fastest growing population of undocumented in America. And that's not because they were coming across the border illegally, but they were more and more of them were visa overstayers. So they came legally somehow, and then they stayed on in America. So I think even people in India have bought into the model minority myth a lot, and they pat themselves on the back thinking that, oh, South Asians, you know, when the Indian Prime Minister goes to America and holds a giant rally with President Trump, you know, everybody in India feels very chuffed and very pleased when Mr. Trump tries to pronounce the names of Indian heroes and he mangles them and he calls Swami Vivekananda something, Swami Vivekanandan Puguram or whatever. You know, everybody says like, oh my God, look, you know, the South Asian, he loves South Asians. But I think it does great disservice to many people in South Asian origin who fall within, for example, and I'll give you one quick example too, and right in the Bay Area, there is a group called Narika, which works with domestic violence. And when India would have its India Day parades in Fremont, I remember the first time Narika tried to get a booth at that parade, many organizers said, I don't know why you want a booth because domestic violence is not a problem in our community. You know, because we're a model minority community. We can't have domestic violence in our community. And so, and of course that is not true, but it means that for people who are survivors of things like domestic violence, it is that much harder to come out and seek help because they themselves are fighting against this sort of self-imposed and externally imposed ideal of being a model minority, because you feel like you're somehow letting your community down by saying that you're being spousally abused in your community.
Sandeep, I would also add that in California, our number one economy is agriculture. And certainly now with this pandemic, there's huge communities and most of the agricultural workers are South Asians. Certainly places like Yuba City, Visalia. I mean, I grew up, I used to live in Sacramento, so Yuba City, I think 40% of the population is South Asian.
Yeah, I'd agree that actually there was a time when a huge number of, especially Punjabis, came to work in the fields. And in fact, there's a man named Dildar Singh Bains, who is known as the Peach King of California, and he is of Punjabi origin. And there's a small side interesting story is that at one time, the agricultural labor was being imported from especially from Punjab. But at that time, because of immigration laws, women were not allowed to come. So many of these Punjabi immigrants who came and started living here ended up marrying Mexican women. So in places like Imperial Valley and Yuba City, there is actually for a while, there has been a sort of a Punjabi Mexican community. And if you go to the Sikh temples or Gurdwaras of Yuba City, you will see benches which are embossed with the name of, you know, Isabel Garcia Singh, and things like that. And there's actually a really interesting documentary called Footprints in the Sand by a woman named Jayashree Hart, which traces these stories of this curious mix of Punjabi men and Mexican women and the culture, the Punjabi Mexican culture that was born with them, you know, and the food and all of that, which these women used to make tortillas, which sort of resembled the rotis that the Punjabi men used to have back home.
Yeah, and I'll jump in to say, as you know, one of the reasons that we're here for API Heritage Month at Foothill College is to push back against the increased wave of anti-Asian xenophobia, hate speech, and even outright physical attacks. And of course, our citizens in California, elsewhere, of South Asian Muslim or Jain or Sikh or Baha'i or other origins have long been targeted by vicious anti-Muslim violence, regardless of whether they're Muslim themselves. I had very painful conversations with my students of Sikh origin who were being attacked on the street as Muslims. And so that is very much part of the picture. I will also mention, Sandeep, that I think that I met you first through our friend, and at that time my colleague at Foothill College, Chitra Divakaruni, who's now gone on to become a world famous novelist. But she did launch her career at Foothill College. Right. And some of her earliest poetry was, in fact, about the South Asian community in Yuba City. She has a wonderful poem about Yuba City. I first think I came to know you because she was fundraising and being the public voice for an organization that still exists, which you know of, called Maitri, which is to support victims of domestic violence within the South Asian community. And the other way that I came to know you was that we had and have a very active non-gender binary support group at Foothill, then called, of course, the Gay Straight Alliance or some version of it. But I came to know you also because of publication of Tricon, which was the first South Asian gay magazine being published in, I think, was it in the United States, at least in California?
Well, actually.
Yeah. So my initial association with you as someone that I was paying so much attention to was within groups where it was very hard to speak out because it contradicted the quote unquote model minority, right? Like, let's not talk about domestic violence. Let's not talk, no, of course, no one from India is gay. Like, that can't be. And the racism also directed within the gay community here against South Asians as well. So it's interesting that that's how we came to know each other. But having said that, maybe this is a good time for you to begin to tell our students, and of course it's a community college, we have students from 16 to 66 and up, all across the spectrum, but many of them are of traditional college age. So I think it would be interesting for you to discuss sort of how you got into this gig, now that you have a global radio presence and Scott Langford's classes gleefully and joyfully read your novel, Don't Let Him Know. And we invite you to events like this. Thank you for, this is not your first trip to Foothill College, although it's the first one by Zoom. But how about letting people in on the Sandeep Roy backstory? Because it's quite a good one. I always love this story.
Professor Langford, really quick, before you continue, what was the novelist's name and how do you spell it? I'd love to look up her work.
Oh, Chitra Divakaruni, and maybe I'll have one of the tech PAs look it up for you. Look up a novel, for example, let's see, Sister of My Heart is a recent
Sister of My Heart. There's a book of short stories called Arranged Marriage. That was her first sort of breakthrough book of short stories.
I happen to have, oh wait, I have to hold this in a place where it's going to show up. I happen to have one of her, this is her most recent book, and it's a retelling, retranslation
of the
Mahabharata from the point of view of the female character, and it's absolutely stunning. So I'll wave that around.
So this one is the Ramayana, and then she has another book called Palace of Illusions, which is about the other great Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, again told from the...
Excuse me. See, that was such an American mistake right there, right? Even I will now blush on camera. It's like getting the Odyssey and the Iliad mixed up on camera.
No, you got it right. That was the Ramayana. The other one was the Mahabharata.
Oh, okay, there we are.
Oh,
I'm always worried that I'm gonna go off the rails. You have to correct me when I do. And I think that's another part of the story. I mean, here you are when you are interviewed by non-South Asians. I do my best. I have friends in the community, but I think there's a deep ignorance often of South Asian traditions and cultures here in the United States. We push back against a little, but again, the model minority sort of thing just papers all that over too as well. But I want you to tell your story of young Sandip Roy coming out of
that was a
college,
very long time
launching
ago,
his
Scott.
career.
I'm going to have to try and remember. Oh my God, that's a long ago flashback. But
well, you're there in your mom's house, right? That ought to help.
Exactly. But before I tell the story, I just wanted to add a couple of things jumping off on what you said about hate crimes and xenophobia. As I think many of you might already know, right after 9/11, for example, the first sort of hate crimes were actually against South Asians. It was a Punjabi gas station owner in Arizona who got called Osama bin Laden and shot and killed by somebody in a pickup truck. And I think that was a very learning moment for South Asians, because at one point there was a sort of a campaign to try and educate people that Punjabi Sikhs, despite their turban and their beards, were not Arabs. But then other people, community groups and South Asian community groups jumped in to say that that was not the point. The point was not to say, oh, we are not the Arabs, they are the Arabs. The point was to say hate crime is wrong across the board, whether you're directing it against Sikhs or Arabs or anybody who looks different. And I think that is something that we often tend to forget, that our solidarity lies across the spectrum, not in differentiating ourselves out as we are the model minority, therefore don't harm us, and they are the bad ones. So that's, I think, an important lesson that the community had to learn. And on a second point from what you said when you were talking about Chitra Divakaruni and Maitri, and Chitra, in fact, was one of the people who blurbed my book too, and has been one of my early mentors in the Bay Area. It is groups like Maitri and Narika who were working with domestic violence, things, as Scott said, are not supposed to happen in a model minority community. They were the ones who gave space to groups like Trikon, South Asian LGBT group, again, something that went against the stream of being a model minority. When we didn't have place to march, when we didn't have booths in India Day Parade, it is they who stood by us, shared their booths and shared their space with us. So in a sense, we owe those groups an immense debt of gratitude. Now to go to my story, I unfortunately have, I always feel a bit of a fraud when I come to these sessions, because, you're supposed to tell the story of like, oh, I always wanted to be a writer, and, I was doodling in a little book, and I wrote a little chapbook, and then maybe a tiny little graphic novel, and all of that. And I was, in fact, a quintessential, stereotypical South Asian, grew up in Kolkata. I studied engineering. I studied computer science. I came to the United States to do a master's in computer science, and then wandered over to Silicon Valley in order to work in Silicon Valley, like 1 million other South Asians have done before me. So I was doing my C++ programming and trying to learn Java. But I also realized all through that while I was reasonably all right at it, my heart was not in it. And so I started volunteering for other writing gigs. This was something I actually loved to do, even though I had zero training in it. I had never taken a writing course. I had not studied English. But I started volunteering for magazines like Trikon, the South Asian LGBT magazine, as well as another magazine that still exists in the Bay Area called India Currents, which was a monthly magazine of events happening around the Indian community. So I would schlep and go down to see some concert by an Indian artist visiting from Bombay or somewhere, and maybe do an interview with them or do a review of the artist. And that is how I sort of started building up my writing chops. And then in 2001, oddly, right before 9/11 happened, I decided that I wanted to quit my software engineering job. And at that time, there existed an organization in San Francisco called New America Media, which was founded by a MacArthur genius named Sandy Close. And it was an organization that was a consortium of all kinds of ethnic media, Chinese media, Arab media, South Asian media, Black media. And the reason it was created was because all the media were very fragmented. But if you added together the subscriber base of the Tsingtao Daily and the World Journal and the El Tecolote and India Currents and India West, and if you added all of that together, their subscriber base actually reached more people than the San Francisco Chronicle did or the San Jose Mercury did, because they reached an enormous immigrant and first generation community. And so I started working for that organization. And at that time, they were hosting a radio show at KLW which ended up being called New America Now. And just on a lark, I sort of auditioned to be the host of that show. And I ended up hosting it for about 10 years. I was actually a guest on the first show. So I'm like this terrible guest who just didn't leave. You just hung around till they made you the host. But it is true that for a long time, even after I had changed my profession, I did not tell my family back in India that I had done this. You know, it was a little hard. It was almost harder to come out about quitting software and becoming a writer journalist than it was to come out as gay. And I think I told my sister, and I finally, at one point, my sister said that, you know, I think you need to tell our mom. And I said, why? Is she getting suspicious? Because I told them I'd changed my job. And so my mother had asked my sister, oh, is he still working in computers? Because she was getting a little suspicious. And my sister, who is actually an English professor, bless her heart, answered very properly and very correctly, he still works with a computer. And I realized that, you know, my life was hanging on a very tenuous thread right there. And so eventually I came clean, but now it's all good. Now there's nothing that pleases an Indian parent more than having some auntie call you and say, oh, I saw your son's article come out in such and such paper. Then everything's forgiven and everyone says, oh yes, you know, you feel pride in your son. That's all it is.
Wow. Okay, well, we will be inviting questions from our participant audience, and as also my co-hosts, Jabin and Chris, who are students in my English 1C Honors Institute class. I might repeat, since some of you have joined us, that you're here for the Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month at Foothill College. We've been joined by Sandip Roy all the way from Kolkata, which is so exciting. It's our first truly international Zoom room encounter for my class, and really in some ways for our Heritage Months as well. And there is a full calendar of events coming up, including next week, another South Asian writer who was born here in the United States, and who is also associated with Foothill College, another former professor at Foothill College, Samina Ali, will be joining us a week from now, and there's a whole list of events there. I want to ask one other question, and then I'm going to let my co-hosts begin questions from the audience or their own. But here we are in the time of COVID, and it's an extraordinary historical moment. Although, as a historian of America, as a historian of American and North American cultures, and as you know, in South Asia, this is certainly far from our first catastrophic plague. And it's something that has shaped the history on both continents deeply and indelibly. In fact, perhaps more deeply and indelibly than any other factor. But what's your current take or perspective there from Kolkata, Sandeep? I realize, I think we all know this is the ultimate moving target. And of course, there's 1 billion people in your country right now. your other country. You're very much an American also. I want to remind our new viewers that Sandeep is a beloved figure for decades here in San Francisco and only recently moved back to Kolkata. So what's up with COVID from your perspective, Sandeep?
Yeah, COVID is fascinating here. What is fascinating is that I honestly, if you had asked me a month ago that a country of 1.3 billion could be shut down, could be locked down, I would have laughed and said that is not possible. And yet that has been done since about the 24th of March. It is surreal to live in a country where there are no planes flying. There has never been a time in modern history when trains have not run in this country, and there are no trains running anymore. People, it's like that is the lifeline of the country. You go outside, and almost all the shops are shuttered except for some grocery stores and things like that. And it is the monumental thing about the lockdown is also it has unleashed great suffering on a lot of people. Thousands and thousands of Indians work as migrants in cities. They come from villages to work in cities like Mumbai and Delhi. They work in construction. They work in labor jobs. They were suddenly left stranded by this lockdown, unable to go back home. And some of you may have seen images of thousands of people literally trying to walk on foot across the breadth of a country as huge as India, trying to go home. It was kind of a historian I know said that he had not seen, that the only image that he could compare that with was of the 1947 partition of India, when thousands of people came from Pakistan to India and India to Pakistan. But then, as he said, at least at that time, the trains were still running. Here, there were no trains running. People literally had, and then when people went home, you have to also understand that all these terms that we talk about as like social distancing and physical distancing and all of that are such luxuries in so many parts of the world. For me, I can socially distance at my home in Calcutta. You can probably socially distance at your home in California. But many Indians who might live 5 to 6 people in a room, or they are migrant workers where they literally live in a room in shifts. Somebody works the day shift, somebody works the night shift, they share the same room. And in those kinds of places, social distancing is a luxury. I have seen pictures of people who have managed to get back to their village, and then they put themselves in a 14-day sort of quarantine, and there's nowhere to do the quarantine. So they're quarantining themselves on top of trees because there's no room in the house. And so this is sort of but it is an amazing experiment in a certain way, a social experiment that the country is going through. This is a country that is built entirely on social connections. We're used to huge marriage celebration, huge funerals, huge festivals, huge prayer meetings. For a country like that to suddenly, wear masks and try and maintain 6 feet from each other is very difficult. I don't know if any of you have gone to India. Indians are terrible at standing in a queue. They will push and they will shove and they will get into every little inch of space they can find. Even in a car, if they can find a little space, they'll try and cram their way in. If you've been on an airplane in India, as soon as it lands, every Indian on that flight jumps up and tries to get their overhead baggage and rush to the exit at the same time. For a country like that to learn something like social distancing is going to be quite an experience. But it's already been 3 weeks. The lockdown has now been extended to the 3rd of May. There are a lot of problems with supply systems, some places are running short of supplies, some hotspots are being sealed off. But also on the plus side, people will say that because the social distancing was imposed so quickly and in some ways so stringently, that touch wood still now, for a country of 1.3 billion, we are not seeing the kind of numbers explode of casualties as there could have been. And in fact, an odd thing is, countries like America and Germany are evacuating their citizens from places like India. And I was reading a quote from an American consular official who said that actually, while they have evacuated some 3,000 Americans from India, in one of the flights, when they kept cold calling people to say there was a flight available to go with some 200 seats, they only got 10 positive affirmations. And it is, to me, a strange that COVID has turned this world order upside down in such a way that it's not that India is safer in any way. You know, our medical infrastructure can be quite rickety and may not be able to cope with a huge explosion of cases. So India, it's not that India is safer, but sitting in India, America does not necessarily feel that much safer either. And that is a huge mind change for us, because traditionally coming from so quote unquote third world country, America was always the safer option. When something like, you know, American, like if you look back at the history of America, it is full of people, immigrants being stopped at the border and quarantined because they are carrying deadly diseases from Jews from Europe, or people from Haiti, or people carrying cholera from South Asia. And now it's flipped around, where people coming from London and America and Italy to India are looked upon with suspicion and quarantined because they might be carrying COVID. So everything's been flipped around. And I've been doing several radio pieces, in fact, about what COVID sounds like. So at some point we might play one of those pieces too.
Okay.
Yao Fang,
Uh-huh.
can you ask your question, and you can unblock your camera too, please?
Yeah. Actually, in the fight against the virus, Indian police just used the corporal's punishment on those who did not comply with the quarantine rules there. While China just shut down the entire city, and there has been a widespread coverage and criticism in the Western media of the China's failure to observe the human rights. But the widespread praise in the Indian for corporal punishment. What do you think of this media coverage?
Sorry, I didn't get that question entirely, but you were talking about corporal punishment.
Yeah, he's talking about there's been a lot of videos from it that the Indian police is using
Beating
sticks
people
to
up.
keep people in line, and you know, and basically using force and physical force to stop people from.
Yeah, in fact, in the initial days, this was very common, where there was actually, what happened was that the lockdown was announced literally overnight. The Prime Minister went on television one night at 8 o'clock, and he said from midnight tonight, the country is locked down. And India is a huge federal country where all the states have different leaders. And so the states were also themselves not entirely prepared for what was coming. And so the police were basically sent out onto the, so even though there were provisions done for exemptions, who were exempt from the lockdown, for example, people out to buy groceries, or people delivering food, people getting medicines and things, police who were out on the street basically just went out with one order in their heads, that is, they needed to clear the streets as fast as possible. And as a result of that, violence was used, people were beaten up, and not just people, even doctors got beaten up trying to get to hospital because police were just like, get out of the road. That initial phase, for the first few days, I think there was a lot of corporal punishment that was used. And then there was a lot of more police training and all of that that happened. And luckily right now it's less so, but there still have been incidents of corporal punishments, especially very recently. In fact, you know, the lockdown was supposed to have been lifted on April 14th, but it was extended till May 3rd. But many of these migrants that I was talking about who were stranded in Mumbai thought that the lockdown would be lifted, and thousands of them converged upon a railway station, hoping that the trains would be running and they would be allowed to go home. And I think police resorted to sort of using their batons and kind of trying to restore order. So there's definitely been a certain amount of corporal violence in trying to instill order here.
Emily, why don't you ask your question?
Hi.
Hi.
I read your article, the COVID-19 extracurricular Olympics. And like you talk a lot about how we're so used to making every moment of our lives productive in some capacity. And I just wanted to ask, like, do you think that because we've stopped distracting ourselves and how many of us had to let go of like relying on like incessant productivity, are we opening ourselves up to like a mental health crisis? And like, I feel that mental health is such an ignored topic in a lot of cultures. So I just wanted to know your opinion on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think that's a really, really important question, because I have talked to a lot of people who have said that is, in a way, yes, definitely. We want to distract ourselves with as many things as possible in order to ignore the fact that many of us feel like we're looking into an uncharted future, that we may be standing at the precipice of an abyss and we don't know what our lives will be like. People keep using the word war, that this is a war on COVID, but a war usually has an end where somebody declares victory, somebody loses, and then you pick up the pieces and you rebuild your life. Here, if tomorrow the lockdown in India is lifted, it doesn't mean our world will go back to what it was pre-lockdown. That world might be gone for a very long time. We will, at the minimum, have to get used to wearing masks. At the minimum, we will worry about how we're going to fly. The virus will still be there, and we will be worrying about the kind of things like physical distancing that we had never thought about. And the mental health issues, I've talked to some people who were therapists, and they said a lot of mental health issues will definitely be aggravated as a result of this. People's sense of insecurity. If you're prone to anxiety attacks, it will not be surprising that this will act as a trigger for more anxiety attacks, and all the wonderful meals that you try and cook and distract yourself with by posting pictures on Instagram may in the end not be sufficient to stave off the anxiety attack. And there have been other issues. For example, organizations that work in domestic violence have said that while some people are like, it's okay, we are getting to spend more time with our family, and this is like quality family time that we didn't have. But for many people who might be sufferers of domestic violence, this is actually a nightmarish scenario, because they are trapped at home with the persons that they are most scared of in if they're in an abusive relationship. And so those incidences of domestic violence and all of things are up without much recourse of shelter to go to, because, so I know a lot of therapists here who have started doing teleconsulting and things like that in order to deal with some of the issues that you were talking about, Emily.
Thank you.
Let's take, and Emily, you can follow up in a second. Co-host, let's take one more question after Emily's, and then I think we could queue up one of the wonderful radio spots that we had discussed airing. Well, I'll let Sandeep choose which one, but I just wanted to kind of get that on your radar. And Emily, go ahead with your follow-up question.
Well, I don't really have any follow-up question, but I appreciate your response. Thank you.
Isha, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. Hi, Sandeep.
Hi, Dave.
I read your article, What Literature Can Teach Us About the Coronavirus, and you mentioned that the only solution is not every man for himself, but a collective response of universal brotherhood, right? In India, especially, like you mentioned, the entire country is based on social connections. So do you think the sense of community and togetherness is greater in India when compared to America? Because I know America often veers towards exceptionalism, and especially in today's age, isolationism, where, as you said, that India is based on social connections.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Disha. And I would say that many people in India would say India, especially as the sort of India that I come from, the middle class, upper middle class India, is veering more towards the American model of individualism and stuff. And, people will say that they don't know their cousins that well, that grandparents will say grandkids don't have time for them in the same way as they used to. But somebody I was talking to here, actually, an epidemiologist, said something very interesting when I mentioned the word social distancing and how India would need to come to terms with that. And he said, I don't like the word social distancing. He said, what we really should be talking about is physical distancing, but social cohesion. And I thought that was very interesting, that the way to combat this pandemic, social distancing, made us sound like we become individual atoms that have no connection to each other. But this pandemic does require a collective response, not just within India, but India collaborating with America. Like if India is shipping supplies of hydroxychloroquine to America, or Brazil are collaborating with Australia. So it actually requires a greater amount of social cohesion, even despite physical distancing. And I think that is something that is very important for us to remember.
Why do you think the upper middle class is veering towards more an American model, in your opinion?
I think because America has become, it's become a sort of a unipolar world, where America is the sole superpower. For many Indians, there is the American dream of going there, striking it rich, becoming a fabulously wealthy NRI in Silicon Valley and having your, house there, like your villa house there, and then coming back to India and lording it around. So that has sort of become the ideal. And so that breeds a certain amount of selfishness in you, where you want your children to succeed and get the leg up and go there. And you will see that within the Indian American community too, where people will often say that, yes, well, we are in here in the golden circle right now. We don't mind drawing up the bridges right now and not letting more people in, because which is where a lot of Indians fall on all sides of the immigration debate in America, where many Indians support a stance where they say, like, no, all we care about is legalization, is green cards being fast tracked. We don't care about family reunification, because that's issues that Filipinos, for example, might be worried about. But our issue is about green card reunification, because that's what matters to us. So in general, I think as a country grows more sort of successful, it does become more materialistic. And so therefore you tend to look out much more for your very much smaller inner circle of your children, rather than the larger family, because fewer and fewer people live in those kinds of extended families, such as the one, say, my mother grew up in, where she grew up as one of whatever 24 cousins, and anybody's mother could smack anybody's child without thinking for a moment as to, oh, is this my own child or not? Now that would be unheard of.
Do you think
Okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, you can do a follow-up. That's great, great.
Do you think in general that the American dream breeds this amount of selfishness, or is it just inherent to like Indians who come to America to pursue the American dream?
I think, as I mentioned before, the Indians there's a kind of a selection bias here, because the Indians who tend to come to America after the 1960s were largely the professional class. A lot of them came to to America, because they felt hamstrung by at that time, socialist India's laws and regulations that made it very difficult for people to start up their own businesses. So as an engineer, you were doomed to be a low-ranking engineer, plugging away at some large company, and it was hard to invent your own thing and start your own company. So in that sense, the American dream is actually a wonderful thing, because it offered a scope of reinvention that very few people had in India. And I will give myself as an example. I don't think if I had not come to America, I don't think I would have become a writer, because I think I would have been too I would have studied computer engineering, programming in India, and have become a software engineer, and never really had the guts to go off the beaten track and try and reinvent myself and becoming a writer. In that sense, the American dream is a wonderful thing, because it tells you that it is okay to try something new and fail at it, possibly, but you can have a go at it. Whereas in India, you often are taught to play it safe and go for the straight and narrow. So in that sense, but then once you're there, because in America also places a huge premium on material success, and the markers of your success are, you know, the kind of car you drive, the kind of, you know, house you own, the zip code in which your house is, and all of that. People will buy into that myth as ways to show who they are within the community that they've made it. Because if you grew up in sort of 70s socialist India, there were only two makes of cars. You know, there was an Ambassador car and a Fiat car. So no matter how rich you were, you still drove the same damn car. So you could, there were far fewer ways to show off your status and wealth.
Okay, and I'm gonna break in here just a little bit. There's another thing we really want to do. We'll come back to questions from students. Thank you. I see so many in the chat room, and that's fantastic. But here in the Bay Area, to this day, Sandeep still is a radio commentator and often heard weekly on our local NPR station, KALW. And has a wonderful series there, and then very often picked up by national public radio. So it's not infrequent that I'm driving down the freeway in the days when I used to go to our campus and drive. I would have NPR on the radio, and here would be the familiar and wonderful voice of Sandip Roy coming to me right in the middle of Morning Edition on NPR. I did want to re-mention something that you mentioned, Sandeep, and underline it for my students, that New American Media was, from my perspective, the great game changer in American journalism in terms of breaking the multiple glass ceilings that I grew up living on the other side of as a white male. But the media presence, including in radio, including in national public radio, including in the public broadcasting system, but all across, was very white male and white male dominated, and still is to this day. This is an ongoing struggle. But New American Media was an absolutely brilliant breakthrough collaboration of multiple journalists of color, including Sandeep, to literally break through that glass ceiling. And as you mentioned earlier in the interview, you were reaching an audience larger than the audiences reached by the traditional American media outlets, because it was a truly global audience. But you were also speaking for so many who had no voice at all. So the fact that I just wanted to say, I think it was a major game-changing contribution to American journalism and media, and has changed that landscape, I hope, forever, although it's not over. And this would include voices of LGBTQ Americans who were also completely excluded from at least being out on, say, NPR when I began teaching at Foothill College. So with all of that in mind, I was thinking, I think you earlier suggested maybe we could listen to Earth Breeze.
Yeah, since we're talking about COVID, maybe.
Yeah, since it's produced for public radio, and since Sandeep has a decades-long career in radio, it has a beautiful beautiful soundscapes in it.
You can see my screen.
India. All right, Chris, you can cue up whenever you're ready.
The first day after India went into a lockdown, I climbed up to the roof of our home in Kolkata. It was quiet, a kind of hush I had forgotten could happen in a city of some 18 million, including its suburbs. I could hear birds, not just crows, but birds of all sorts, rustling in the mango tree next door. The young, unripe mangoes are bright, luminous green against the dark leaves. The drumstick tree on the other side was in flower, delicate white blossoms and long drumstick pods. For a moment, I felt disoriented. Normally at this time, I could hear the sound of traffic, the vendors cycling through the neighborhood, trying to buy old scrap metal. the airplanes passing overhead, the sound of honking cars. But this bird song laden hush felt oddly familiar too. Then I remembered a few months ago I had gone up to the Himalayas. This is what it had sounded like up in the mountains, in our little bungalow in the middle of nowhere, waking up to the sound of bird song and a view of snow-capped peaks. In a strange way, the coronavirus had recreated that feeling, minus the snow-capped peaks, in the middle of Kolkata. This is Sandip Roy in Kolkata. The pandemic is wreaking havoc, unleashing so much suffering in India and beyond. Thousands and thousands of Indians, poor day laborers, had been stuck on the road for the first few days, unable to return to their homes. Railway compartments have been turned into quarantine chambers. And yet amidst all this havoc, nature is breathing. In the city of Jalandhar in northern India, over 200 kilometers from the mountains, residents woke up one day and for the first time in at least 30 years saw snow-capped Himalayas from their rooftops. The Yamuna River, usually a grey-brown sludge thanks to factories pumping their waste into it, is blue again. Peacocks are dancing. Living in Kolkata, I am looking at my city with new eyes and listening to its heartbeat in a way I never had. I saw a mongoose in our garden the other day, standing on its hind legs. A snake sunned itself on the wall. A yellow and black bird with a long tail hops around the tree next door. Crow pheasants waddle in the empty lot behind the house. Woodpeckers have shown up, black and white with a bright red crest. Little grey palm squirrels with black stripes on their back run up and down the trees all day long, chirping excitedly. It's like I found Thoreau's Walden Pond in my own urban backyard. All day long, the street, which would usually see a steady stream of vendors, sits empty, baking in the hot summer sun. There's no endless stream of couriers pulling up on noisy motorbikes to deliver telephone bills and Amazon packages. The only regular visitor is the trash collector. He too has a mask on his face as he goes from door to door, blowing his whistle and picking up trash. The only other sound we listen for is the vegetable vendor who comes once a day on a bicycle cart, blowing his squeaky horn. He has a mask on his face and a cart filled with potatoes and onions and cauliflowers and wilting spinach. For once, no one bargains or complains about the quality. Some days he's late, and we stand at the door waiting as if for Godot, because we're out of limes or onions. One day we had a bonus visitor. A man rode by on a bicycle, selling green coconuts. Our dog, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, barked vigorously, perhaps because he was thankful that he had something to bark at finally. Our garden tomatoes have been harvested, and the eggplants, we are watching the papaya grow. Garden vegetables, once a hobby, are now a lifeline of sorts. They'll save us one trip to the market, where food shops are open, but often low in supplies. A neighbor died, though not of the virus. My sister paid a condolence visit, standing on the street with a makeshift mask covering her face, while the neighbor's daughter stood in her balcony, mourning at social distance. But nature marks the season whether or not our human world is out of whack. After a sudden storm, the ground is littered with tiny green mangoes the size of ping-pong balls. There are no kids around to collect them. The quail bird calls incessantly as it does every spring. Soon, it will all be back to its old, noisy, polluted self. But for these few weeks, as humans suffer, the earth is healing itself. I just wish we didn't need a pandemic to hear our earth breathe. This is Sandeep Roy in Kolkata for KALW.
Wow, thank you so much, Sandeep. I've listened to that piece about 6 times now, and I've not grown the least bit tired of it. It's such a lovely and gentle message in the midst of all the chaos and fear. And of course, we're experiencing that here in California also.
Yep.
And the entire world. I think my favorite line in there at the moment is that the dog is so grateful for finally having something to bark at. That really nails it. And I'll mention we're coming up on our second hour here. If you're joining us, that we're here with Sandip Roy, and this is part of the Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month at Foothill College. We're here with my class, English 1C Honors Institute at Foothill College. And that piece works so perfectly in 2 ways for us, Sandeep. One is that one of the main themes of the class is the global climate crisis, the global environmental crisis, which is grave in both India and the United States, as you know well. But we're also a class that's about writing. And the students are asked at the end of this API Heritage Month to contribute to an online magazine that's called The Global Citizen. So I think that your piece, as so often, I'm always astounded at how beautifully crafted. I mean this from the heart too. Like your radio pieces are beautifully crafted pieces of writing, and of course you have powers that we do not have as print writers. You're a print journalist also. To bring in the sounds, but I do think that they're models of new ways to communicate a profound point in ways that really do communicate. So I wanted to thank you for that. Now that was all very long. Let's see. I think maybe we can just let more student questions in at this point. If Chris or Jubin wants.
Jonah, go ahead.
Go ahead,
You're going to ask your question and make sure you unblock your video.
Is Saba here?
Jonah?
Hi, sorry, I didn't catch the name. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I read your article from Namaste to Corona Drugs, and you wrote about how the roles of East and West are subverted in these times, how the West is looking to the East for inspiration on how to conduct themselves in these times. So I was wondering, actually, like I've seen this happen in real life as well, like people's ideals of democracy are being broken down, there's less trust in the government, and especially people in the West are looking at their own people and seeing things that they don't like the greed that was resulted from when the coronavirus started, like people hoarding items. And there's a big spirit of collectivism in the East that isn't present in the West. So I was wondering if you have any hopes or predictions for how the post-corona world will function.
We all have hopes. I think predictions would be everybody would be very daring to make predictions because we really feel like we're in very uncharted waters right now. But I think so I'll just talk in terms of hopes, even if they may not come true. One of the virologists I talked to said, we are behaving as if this virus is like the first enormous challenge that has suddenly been thrown at us and is literally throwing our world out of orbit. But we have to understand, as what Scott was talking about, that with climate change, such things are going to become more and more common, that viruses jumping, it's not just about a wet market in Wuhan. Viruses will be jumping that have been inhabiting animals safely for thousands and thousands of years, will be jumping to human hosts because our habitat is encroaching on the animal's habitat. So the clash between species is becoming more, and this should, if nothing else, be a wake-up call for that. in that piece, I was talking about the Himalayas suddenly becoming visible. When this Indian government came to power about, this is the second term, so about 8 years ago, one of its great missions was to clean up the rivers of India. Um, it didn't really succeed in doing that, but it feels like 3 weeks of lockdown because of a coronavirus has managed to do more to clean up the rivers in India than 8 years of government programs have. And so all of these in certain ways is a lesson that I feel that the earth is telling us that things can be healed and things can be changed if we want to do it. And one of the things I hope that it will happen is that we will probably realize that maybe we don't always need to board. I mean, obviously we will fly again. Obviously we will travel again. Obviously I hope to visit my other home in California again. But we shouldn't take that as something that, oh, we will fly just because we can. Or rather, we should be thinking about, do we really need to fly, or can we Zoom and talk to each other, and that might be good enough for now and give the earth some breathing space. And I think so in that sense, I hope if there is any silver lining to the amount of misery and horror that is happening in the world, it is to point out several things. One is that as so many powerful nations in the world, including India. India has plans to put people on the moon. It has a moon expedition. It has all of that. But what does that matter if at the end of the day you don't have respirators for people who are dying? And as an epidemiologist I talked to said, in all of India there are about, as 1.2 billion people, there's about 5,000 epidemiologists. And he says every time there's a fire, then we all want the firefighters. But as soon as the fire goes out of our national consciousness, we forget about the firefighters and their needs, and we pay them miserable salaries. And he said, instead of focusing so much uh, on respirators or ventilators as way, I hope that what this pandemic teaches us in the post-colonial world is to prepare for a pandemic, to prepare to increase our surveillance, to prevent chaos during a pandemic, instead of trying to react to a pandemic and try to figure out whether we have enough ventilators and hospital beds.
All right, thank you. That was a great response.
Thank you.
Alice has a question. Is Alice here?
Yes, hello.
Hello. Hi, Alice.
Hello. So I read your article, the COVID-19 Extracurricular Olympics, and you mentioned like there was a tweet. So I'm curious as in like, what is your viewpoint on like people lacking discipline if they don't come out of quarantine acquiring new knowledge or skills? Like, do you think it's necessary to make every moment of our lives productive?
I don't know, what skill are you trying to acquire, Alice, as a result during this quarantine?
Well, I'm not so sure yet, but
But good. I'm glad that some people are not so sure. I think what I'm most alarmed by are the people who seem to be so sure that they're going to come out of this learning an absolute new skill. I am trying to practice my yoga plow pose. I have to admit, and I'm almost there, but I'm not there. But I think I think what I was that article I wrote it kind of tongue in cheek, as because I was just getting tired of seeing all the fabulous food pictures my friends were putting up on Instagram. And I felt like, just my daily chores of keeping the house clean and putting and cooking and stuff was taking up so much of my day. I didn't know how people were having time to do all these other extra things that time seemed to have magically opened up for them, whereas it felt like it had shrunk for me. But on the other hand, I think, as I was mentioning a little earlier, part of this is also our way of denying the fact that something really profound is happening to us. That we are, for the first time, we like to chart our lives. We want to know what we want to know what our goals are. Do we map out our objectives? We want to live our lives like a PowerPoint presentation so that we check up all the bullet points and then we know what outcome there will be. And this is for the first time, we don't know what the outcome of anything will be. And as human beings, we deal very badly with uncertainty. And this is one of, for many of us, it's one of the most uncertain phases of our lives, where literally as students, you don't know whether your college is going to reopen, on campus when it's going to reopen. I don't know when India is actually going to come out of lockdown. They say May 3rd, maybe it will be May 19th, maybe it will be June. I don't know. This is the first time in my life I don't know whether I can make a plan for anything in July. The Olympics have been canceled. So this kind of profound uncertainty is something we have a great difficulty dealing with. So I feel like we try to compensate for that by trying to acquire this skill, that skill, and others, so that we feel good of having done something. But at some time, I think there is some value in just absorbing the uncertainty and admitting to ourselves that we don't know what is going to happen. And uh, sometimes I think it is okay not to feel like I need to acquire new skills, but it is okay to just be with the people that you love and care about, and think of this time perhaps as time that you've gotten to spend with them, and just focus on that instead of trying to improve yourself all the time. That's just my 2 bits.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Jamie's next. Is Jamie here on the call?
Hi, Sandeep. Thank you
Hi.
for joining us this morning. Or I don't know what time it is there, but thank you for joining us. My question is regarding the humility that will come out of the coronavirus. And I was inspired from your article, From Namaste to Corona Drugs, West is Looking East for Survival Tips. And I hadn't known that Donald Trump was seeking aid from India. And I was very interested on your perspective, just the way that Indian immigrants are seen when they come back home. And that was just a very interesting story. And it said that one just hopes that when we emerge from this pandemic, we will remember these lessons with humility. And I think that Donald Trump is very prideful, and he wouldn't have ever admitted seeking help from India. So what other lessons of humility do you hope that as a society and as global citizens, we will learn from this pandemic?
That's a really good question, because I fear sometimes that we can draw the wrong lessons from say a Donald Trump asking for hydroxychloroquine from India. An Indian can look at it and say, oh, now we are on top of the world, like, look, America is asking us for help. And so that gives us bragging rights. And I felt like, initially when India had said that there was a ban on hydroxychloroquine exports from the country, Donald Trump had actually made some threatening noises about, like, oh, there might be consequences in trade deals and stuff like that. But then when India said, no, no, we will give this thing, then he was all very sugar and spice and all things nice about it. But trade deals aside, I think that is the important thing. It is not to look at the fact that, oh, India has hydroxychloroquine, which America wants right now, and therefore India is holding the upper hand. And that is the change in the world order, where until now America held the upper hand and India wanted favors from America. Now America wants favors from India. I think when I was talking about humility, it is to understand that in the end, we are all in this together. I mean, this is a virus that is affecting India and China and America and Singapore and Korea and all of these countries. And there is, if something like a hydroxychloroquine is of use to fight this virus, it will fight this virus in India, it will fight this virus in America. And it should reinforce to all of us that in the end, that we will sink together or float together. And that is sort of the lesson in humility, that none of us in the end, despite our superior dollar power, or because we have greater research facilities, or because we have a greater population manpower, none of us are in the end superior to the other, that we are all going to need each other's help. If America needs hydroxychloroquine from India, India might need the medical laboratory expertise from America. And that in the end, just this world pandemic mean something mean all encompassing. It is embracing the whole world. And so in that sense, the response should also be pandemic in that same sense. It can't be an American response or an Indian response to the virus. It has to be a collective response. And for that, I think there needs to be humility on all sides, where people understand, as a result of that humility, that we actually need each other, that this is not a moment of showing who is more powerful or who, like if you remember in the early days of the Donald Trump presidency, there was always these jokes about the fact that, about his handshake, right? That he would grip people's hands really hard, and it was just like he would gauge people, like, oh, when he's shaking Emmanuel Macron's hand in France, Macron complained that he like really squeezed it very hard. But now we've come to a world where the handshake is dangerous and everyone is having to do namaste instead. So instead of trying to prove who has the stronger handshake, maybe we can all come to a point where we do a namaste where there's no stronger or weaker namaste at all.
The irony of all this is that Donald Trump ran and is an anti-globalization or anti-globalist in the same way as Bernie Sanders is, but in a sense, globalization is here. We could kick and scream about it, but in a sense, it's here, and we need each other's ingenuity, manufacturing, and all these different things. And so I think, to me, it's ironic that the people that like to talk about, America first or bad trade deals, even now, I mean, we see it today. I mean, I work in a hospital, and the shortage of PPEs is because of the extra tariffs that are on equipment, and even like hand sanitizers have all these tariffs, 25% tariffs, that make it really expensive and hard to import them, to even make them here. So
thank you for answering my question.
We'll take a couple more questions, and then maybe we can do another radio piece. I would love to vote for your idea, Sandeep, that what if we have a pandemic of compassion? What if we have a pandemic of understanding? What if we have a pandemic of communication? What if we have a pandemic of and so I'd love to, that was such a great thing that you got to cough there, Jobin. That was like perfect timing. But I do think that that's a beautiful message. Let's take some more student questions. I'm very happy with these questions, and I know we have more. We don't have time for all of them, but I'd like to squeeze in a few more. Sandeep, are getting to the point in the evening. Someone was asking, sort of what time it is over there, and you're pushing. You're definitely pushing past midnight.
At midnight, I'll turn into a pumpkin. It'll be really fun.
Oh, well, we have to stay on at least that long. But I want to let you know that we did go quite long with Meili Chai last Tuesday because she was willing to do that for us. But I also want to be mindful that you have a family and kind of get other things. Kind of have other things to do, so let us know when you start to feel like your battery's running low. But let's take a few more questions right now, and I'll let
Jonah, you're next. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Siobhan.
Jonah, you're next. Please unblock your video.
Okay. Hello. My name is Jonah, and I have a question regarding your article. What literature teaches us about coronavirus? Is a collective response of global brotherhood even possible in a global community that seems to value self-interest? I realize my question is kind of long, so I guess I'll just start there and then continue with your response, whatever that may be.
Thanks for that, Jonah. I would like to think that it is possible, because I think anything is possible. And I think, if anything, it is a crisis of the proportions of corona that should be opening us up to that possibility. Because you're right, in some ways, the world has been careening towards the opposite directions, where more and more we've seen people coming into power in countries which is all about putting my country first and the others be damned. It's all about building walls, to keep people out. That has happened in America. That has been happening in India as well. Right before the corona pandemic hit, there was an enormous agitation going on in India, which was about a citizenship bill that was being passed, which many people thought was a way to try and determine who was a real Indian and who was not a real Indian, and those people might get cast out as a result. And they may, people thought of it as a way to discriminate between Hindus and Muslims and all of that. So absolutely, the world has been going towards a stronger feeling of ethno nationalism, trying to define more concretely who belongs to a country and define the other, as it were, to set the other aside and make clearer boundaries and demarcations for the other. But I think the one thing that I've seen, at least in India, is in some ways, Corona has wiped a lot of that out, where a lot of people now realize that this is affecting all of us. So as a kind of small example, I'll say I'm part of my school WhatsApp group, and half the time I try to quit my school WhatsApp group because it feels just too juvenile. Everybody there still seems to be 15 years old. They still seem to be sharing the same sort of slightly risque jokes that they shared when they were 15, and or they have really bitter political arguments. They're fighting about Hindus versus Muslims, and those Muslims or whatever, and all of that. But ever since Corona has happened, even in that group, even in that fractious environment of that group, which I'll take as a very small petri dish of what you're talking about, Jonah, I have seen people sort of come together and talk about nothing else but the virus and how to deal with it, and try and be helpful to each other in terms of offering tips and suggestions. I have seen people who have been bitterly ideologically opposed to each other and literally almost stormed out of the groups because of a political fight, where one person says, oh, when the lockdown started, he was worried about his elderly mother-in-law who was alone here, and how was she going to get her groceries and everything. And this guy, who is sort of politically implacably opposed to him, is making calls from Australia to his relatives in Calcutta to try and get groceries delivered to this person's mother-in-law. So I think, in a way, if as a result of this, we can discover that within all these sort of social differences, which a lot of which are exacerbated by being on social media, to be honest, because nothing brings out our flaring as much as being on Twitter and having a good old Twitter war, that within us there is a common need for survival and some basic kind of humanity and goodness. It was reassuring to say that, even I am guilty of demonizing somebody whose viewpoints are radically different from mine. And then when I see that person go out of his way to do a good deed for someone else, I sort of feel reassured, not just in humanity, but in myself. And I feel a little sheepish that I judged him solely because of his political conviction. So I'm hoping that some of that will stick around even post corona. I don't know, I'm not being utopian and saying, like, this, we will come into some kind of rainbow brotherhood after this, but I think the corona has been a wake up call for us to realize how small and insignificant and how um, powerless we are sometimes, despite all that we have achieved, against something as tiny as a virus that has brought us all to our knees.
Okay, so let me see if I got this right. Do you view coronavirus realistically as enough of a shock to inspire global community, or do you think that it was just a wake-up call? And that
I think it's a wake-up call. It's too early for me to say that it was enough of a shock to inspire the global community. I think it's a wake-up call, definitely, because it is, for many of us, the first experience of something that is happening all over the world simultaneously, but different countries have reacted in different ways. I mean, Donald Trump's reaction to the virus has been radically different from the Prime Minister of New Zealand's reaction to the virus. Has been different from Boris Johnson. But I will also say that these things do have after effects. I was talking to a person who studies migration in India, and he was saying that in 1918, when there was the great influenza epidemic and thousands of people died in India, a sort of similar thing happened where, again, it ravaged migrant communities who were living in close quarters and therefore were more prone to the virus. Many of these thousands then fled the cities of Mumbai and went back to their villages, and they didn't come back. So one of the net results of the virus was that when the viral influenza receded, suddenly cities faced a great shortage of migrant labor. Construction was affected. Things that people had taken for granted that migrants did. You know, people just wanted the outcome of migrants' labors. They didn't really care about the way migrants lived or what kind of rights they had or what kind of living conditions they had. They just wanted their buildings built and their food delivered and things like that. And suddenly with the migrants gone, they were suddenly construction faced labor. And he said that a lot of India's labor laws and movements actually indirectly came out of the devastation caused by the flu epidemic, where suddenly the supply of migrant labor dwindled and the demand became high after it. And he said he would not be surprised if after Corona, where lots of people, as we have seen recently in India, when there was a rumor the lockdown would be lifted and thousands of people were trying to get back to their villages, that there might be again a certain kind of labor shortage in the cities, especially in construction and all of that. So there might be some social impact of that.
Wow, Sandeep, thank you so much for those insights. I'm gonna pose a question because I'm a writing teacher, and because you're a writer, and and as I mentioned, the students that are in the room with us right now, my students at least, actually all students at Foothill College and anywhere else, you included, Sandeep. So we have an online magazine on medium.com that's called The Global Citizen. That was a name that was given by Foothill students, not christened by me. The students will all be writing for it. And I think that some writing advice in terms of either your process or or just straight up advice to emerging journalists would be great. I'll preface this with a little anecdote. We had a pre-meeting earlier this week to get ready. And I mentioned to Sandeep in our pre-meeting that I had assigned this new book that I haven't used before called Shut Up and Write. And I was literally astounded that this look of sort of pain crossed my friend Sandeep's face, of all people. Because speaking of humility, every time I log on to your blog or your radio program or your anything else, you just churn this stuff out, and I hang my head in shame as a writer, because it's like how I have no idea how you churn these things out, because they are so finely crafted, including the Earth Breathes piece that we just heard you read from your radio show. So within the context of Shut Up and Write and the Global Citizen, do you have advice for our students as emerging writers and journalists about how do you address a truly global pandemic crisis or anything else? They don't have to write about COVID. How do you address global issues in a way that's effective and doesn't sort of just land you in a sea of cliches and truisms and sort of first thoughts coming into your head? How do you find focus? How do you shut up and write? That as well. Okay.
I wish I knew, as I told Scott that time, after I wrote my first book, everybody immediately, your first book is literally, the ink has literally not dried on the page when people say, what are you writing next? When is your next book coming out? And then I feel like, oh God, the next book is not there because I'm too busy writing the next article. Books. And that is a problem, I think, for many writers' space. Oddly, when I worked as a software engineer, it was easier to find time to write because it was almost like different parts of my brain. I could work on software programming in Redwood City all day and then go back to my home in San Francisco and sit down on a computer and do what was creative writing and join a writing group. Now that I actually work as a writer, columnist, journalist, I feel like I use that part of my brain. And after I've written a column, I don't really feel like necessarily on the longer creative writing process. So the thing that's always worked best for me as a writer is a deadline. There's nothing like a kick in the seat of your pants to make you shut up and write, because there's a deadline looming. I have my KLW deadline every week on Monday morning, my time. I need to send it in. And even as much as I plan and I say I'll do it in advance, I know that deadline is coming. Sunday evening, I'm still scrambling to make that deadline and trying like, oh shit, what do I need to write? What am I going to talk about this week? So there's nothing like a deadline to get your creative juices flowing. But I think the biggest advice I would have as somebody who actually does not come from a writing class background, does not come from having studied an MFA, done an MFA, I think, is to believe in your voice and to believe in your story in a way that you're not trying to imitate someone else's voice. There are lots of writers. So you must read a lot, but not for the point of emulating that writer, but rather to absorb the insight. So when you read it to see how is that person telling that story. And I found when you're talking about a global story that the best way for me personally to approach, and it may not be true for everyone else, is to place myself in the story, because I know the thing I know the best about is me and my experience. So if I am talking, for example, that piece that you heard about, that audio piece on COVID and what it sounds like, it made sense to me to not write about a piece about India or even about Calcutta, but to start with the mango tree next to my house and the squirrels that were in that mango tree next to my house. And then through those squirrels, I hope to slowly expand it out to a larger world audience who will find something universal that they can hear. Whereas I think if I start with the world, I have the danger of, as you say, falling victim to trying to cliches and truisms, because in the end, the world is so vast that, none of us can grasp it. But if we can grasp our little grain of sand, our little neighborhood, and radiate out to the larger world, hopefully there will be some points of resonance with other people. And when I started doing audio essays for National Public Radio many years ago, that is how it started. Like I remember the very first audio essay I did was a piece on Bollywood coming to the Bay Area. And instead of doing a reported piece on Bollywood coming to the Bay Area, I remember my editor at National Public Radio, a wonderful woman named Maeve McGoran, and said, write about your own relationship with Bollywood. And I said, oh, but I was taught to be snooty about Bollywood. We didn't watch Bollywood films growing up because they were regarded as too, lowbrow. And she said to write about that, about how you wrote, how you found Bollywood lowbrow. And then you come to America and you discover America has discovered Bollywood, and there are Bollywood dancing classes happening in Fremont. And so in a way, it became a story of Bollywood, but it was really my journey into my understanding of Bollywood from India to America. And I found that has been the easiest way to actually tell a story, because in the end, that's all we are trying to do. We're trying to tell a story. We are not trying, if in the process of telling the story, we tell something that is a great truth, that's great. But I think if we start out thinking like, I am going to write an essay which will expound on a great and profound truth, we will find ourselves drowning in that truth. But in the end, I think the hardest thing to be as a writer is to be honest. And I think for me, that is still a huge work in progress, because every time you write and you put yourself into it, it is like stripping bare in front of an audience and showing, and and you don't look like one of those chiseled bodies that you see in magazines. It is, you see the bags under your eyes and the double chin and all of that, and you realize that the people can see you. And in the end, you have to develop a bit of a thick skin and realize that once you've written something, it's out there and people will read it and will interpret it the way they will. And you cannot control the way people read it. All you can control is the way you write it. And so write it carefully. As an old teacher of mine said, and I quoted him in my book, that big words are not necessarily the right words. Write simply, but choose the words well, but don't worry about writing, that your words are too simple.
Great, and I'm going to follow up with an observation of my own, and we heard it so vividly in the radio piece, and that's that it's wonderful, your mastery of sensory details as a way to make your writing come alive, and it's part of focusing on your own experience, but of course you do that in your novels for your characters. So you bring us to the sights and smells and sounds of India, but in say, Don't Let Him Know, there's the wonderful scene of an older South Asian woman character who daringly goes to McDonald's, and it's you take us into the McDonald's, or who daringly at the end of the novel ends up in a gay disco, and has a great time. So it's all kind of I think that's another trick that I want my students to observe in your writing. And I think you do it beautifully, and so does Mei Li Chai, who was here with us earlier this week. Really all of the authors that I'm hosting, because it is part of the writer's toolkit. And just because you don't have a radio show and a sound engineer doesn't mean that you don't have a sound engineer in your head. So you want to follow up a little bit with that, Sandeep? When do you add the sensory details? I mean, that's an interesting, I never asked you that.
Actually, part of it was definitely helped by the fact that when I started doing radio, I realized the challenge of having to try and describe a scene to someone who could not see it. And you had to do it in very few words, because on radio, you had 3 minutes, 4 minutes to set a scene, describe it, set and tell you a story. And when you're telling a story about a quote unquote ethnic community, you needed even more setup, because you had to explain what a sari was, you had to explain what Bollywood was. These were not given terms, so you had to economize that use of time. So you had to learn very quickly to pick up little details and use them to set a sense of place. And as a reporter on the field, at one point I used to make this mistake where I would take photographs. I would take a lot of photographs of things, and when I came back, I would try and use the photographs to write and describe the scene. And then I realized that it didn't work, because the photograph captured everything. And then when I looked at the photograph, I was overwhelmed by it, because I didn't know what I had actually been focusing on. Whereas when I was taking notes, I would note things like that blue window, or that red dress that was drying on the clothesline by the blue window. And that was what was important. That was what my eye was drawn to. But when I took the photograph, that red dress was just one little detail lost in the rest of the photograph. So I think as a writer, taking notes is very important, because the notes hone in on the details of the things you are, and they act as triggers for the memories when you actually sit down to write something. And one of the things and this might be a radio thing, is that I found it, even when I'm writing a simple op-ed piece or a column or something, I've actually found it very useful to read it aloud to myself. Mm. When you read something aloud, it is something about the cadence of it. You realize how often you repeat words inadvertently, and then you realize you keep saying the same word over and over again. That maybe it has been 4 sentences before, but you've used the same phrase, the same turn of phrase, because some things are just hardwired in your brain, and it's by reading aloud that you notice jarringly that, oh, you're repeating yourself, and then you change your construction. And I think reading aloud has helped me a lot. And I think what radio has done is actually helped me to be very economical and sparse with knowing what are the details that so in the scene that you're talking about, where the older woman goes into a McDonald's, I knew as soon as I went into the McDonald's and I looked at it, I didn't go into a McDonald's and take notes, but I tried to remember a McDonald's sitting outside a McDonald's. And the first things I could remember were colors. I could remember the yellow and the red of the McDonald's clowns. And then I remembered the sort of the color of the floor, the orange of the ketchup smear, the smell of fries coming out. And it was out of those details that I constructed the memory of a McDonald's, which was not about, oh, it is 600 feet by 300 square feet, and there are 4 counters, all those little details were not important. But the smell of fries hanging like a fog, that I remember. The color of the thing, and the sort of pastel pink and greens, and the bright yellow and red, and then the door swinging open and that smell of French fries that comes out. Those were the details that stuck with me, and I knew those had to go into the piece.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. I'm kind of watching the clock, and many of my students may need to go off to other educational activities and or their lives. Same with you. But at the same time, as you know, sometimes there's a kind of lingering after the formal presentation period. So I'm going to leave it up to you again. That might be a good place to end. Or do you want to take a few more questions on your side, since it's at midnight? You haven't yet turned into a pumpkin. We're all waiting, and I've been waiting, and nothing's happened yet.
Yeah, I can take a couple of questions. That's fine.
Rhea is next, or Reha.
See if Rhea's still there.
Are you still there, Reha?
Okay, let's try another. Let's keep
Cool.
somebody else.
Let's try Athenias, or Athe.
Hello.
Hello.
So my question was, in your article, it was what literature can teach us about the coronavirus. You mentioned La Peste, the plague by Albert Camus. And like in there, you said that it was not only an allegory for like the Nazi occupation of France, but also about the plague. And in fact, it was also about the actual fact that it was the plague in Algeria at the time. And I was thinking, because I know that in France, people don't feel obliged to anything. They still go outside, even though the police officers are there and they're not supposed to, and there are fees like put in place. But I was wondering if India was more disciplined than France or any other country was. And if so, if we learned from what it had caused in the past. Like,
that's funny, because I think I would say people in India think they're the most indisciplined country in the world. It's very hard to get Indians to follow any rules. As I mentioned a little while ago, like just watching Indians trying to stand in a queue, you will notice that they are not disciplined at all. So they look at other countries where people stand in an orderly queue at an airport, whereas in India, as soon as there's a queue, somebody will rush to the front of the queue and try to break the queue. So in a way, this coronavirus and having in this lockdown is proving to be a lesson in disciplining for a country that is famously indisciplined. And in fact, in Kolkata, where I live, the woman who is the chief minister of the state, she's kind of like the governor of California would be, she's the leader of the state. She literally, in the early days of the pandemic and the lockdown, she was literally on the street with a chalk, marking circles on the sidewalk, trying to teach people how to stand in physical distancing while buying groceries. So she was going into the market to a grocer and demonstrating by hands, like, this is how you buy something without touching. And she was drawing little circles and chalks on the ground. And she was telling people, you stand here, and you stand here, and you stand here. But even then, sometimes I think people are getting much more disciplined. Like recently, people have gone to grocery stores and said that it's much more, people go in 2 or 3 at a time, and all. Though there have been some cases of indiscipline where I've seen a photograph of, they've drawn these circles on the ground in front of a shop, but because it's very sunny, everybody has put their little bag or something on one of the circles to mark their spot. And then they've all clustered together, sitting together in the shade, no social distancing at all. So, some lessons are going to take a while to be acquired.
all right, thank you.
I would also add that in the West, we're more entitled than disciplined, or lack of discipline, than the East, where I just wanted to kind of do a follow-up on that. How do you think colonialism, or the remnants of colonialism, has crept into the Indian psyche in a sense where there's still a lot of the older people have this fear of government and colonialism, and how do you think that has affected them?
I think the effect of colonialism is actually slightly different. I think the effect of colonialism, which I think is being changed. So, for example, in Kolkata, where I live, for as long as I remember, London returned was a term of great pride. People used it as an adjective, like if you were London returned, your price on the marriage market went up exponentially. And everything. So that was definitely a colonial hangover. Now, for the first time, when you're London returned, people are nervous about you because they think that you might be carrying a COVID virus. So that has sort of flipped the balance. But I think there is a fear of government, which is not necessarily just about colonialism, because India has had its stints with authoritarian government as well. In the 1970s, the then prime minister imposed a state of emergency in the country, suspended the constitution, and a lot of political opponents were thrown into jail. And even now, with the current administration, there has been, people who have not toed the government line, who have been dissidents, have found themselves victimized. Media has been accused of being extra compliant and all of that. So in that sense, it's not just colonialism. There is a sense of big government, big brother, and there is, in some places, people admire a country like Singapore, where everything runs very efficiently, and there is a sort of a benevolent, authoritarian look to it, and some people think that is the only way a country as heterogeneous as India can function. But the fact is, India is a terribly heterogeneous country, and it is very hard to corral everybody into the same box. And in a way, this pandemic is a huge lesson for India to try and figure out how it can unitedly fight something together despite all the differences of caste, class, religion, language that it has to deal with on a daily basis.
What do you think of the caste system in India, and how do you think it has changed as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic, as well as do you think that this COVID-19 pandemic is also kind of bringing in like a lot of the millennial forces that a lot of millennials have been facing, kind of like flexing on other people in a way?
Well, I think the caste system, I think, is unaffected by COVID-19 in a way, because it is something deeply ingrained in India. And while, the fight against the caste system goes on in many different levels across the country, there are excellent books like this one called Coming Out as Dalit by a woman named Yashika Dutt, who talks about how for years she passed as being upper caste when she was actually somebody from the lower caste, and the sort of the trauma that was there. And in a bizarre way, I sometimes fear that that COVID-19 could almost become, with its emphasis on physical distancing and not touching, could almost become a way for some people to try and legitimize old caste biases, where they say, well, because a lot of caste biases were about not touching people, or the word used to be untouchable at one time of people of the lower caste, and in a way the COVID is sort of reinforcing those biases in a certain way. But I think it will also mean here, in terms of caste system, also more than caste, also class is coming into effect here, because COVID in India has largely come here from people who've traveled abroad and brought it here. And so somebody I know described it as a richer person's disease, which they have then transmitted to people who work for them. And so if now it spreads in a slum in Bombay, in some ways it is a richer employer who has given it to his or her maid or driver, who has then gone back to the slum that they lived in and spread it in other ways, which in a way is flipped around from usual pandemics, which arise from squalid, overcrowded conditions in slums, and then the rich are trying to protect themselves from it. In a way, in the same way as I talked about the world order being subverted, even here, those orders are being subverted.
Okay, and I'm thinking maybe we'll take two more questions, and if Sandeep continues to fail to turn into a pumpkin or show us his glass or whatever is going to happen. Two more questions, as long as you can handle that, Sandeep. Are you all right with that?
I'm all right with that. I'm just going to get a little darker because.
Oh, you're turning into a pumpkin. It's working.
See who's next. Oh, Reha actually, her mic's not working, so I'll just tell her her question. In your article, What Literature Can Teach Us About the Coronavirus, your friend Milena, am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
Was refused by a cab driver to turn the air conditioning on because she had just come back from Dubai and there was an infection there. He did, however, tell her he would turn it on for more money. Do you think that it is taking advantage of people during a global crisis, or does the cab driver have the right to demand more for risking his life to help with transportation?
That's an interesting question. I think it was actually a matter of people not knowing what the heck was going on. I think it was just a matter really of people being very scared. Because at that time, this was in the early days of it, India had still not locked down at that point. And so people were just dealing with this unknown sort of boogeyman of a virus, which they associated with foreigners. And so I think it was less that she was actually had come back from Dubai, but that she was of somebody foreign who was in his cab that made him nervous. The fact that she'd been actually living in India for 6 months and all of that, he didn't know anything about. And so I think in a certain sense, that writer, that cab driver was in his right to do something that he felt safe about. Unfortunately, asking for 30 rupees more was not going to make him any safer in the end. So, it's fine if he got his 30 rupees more, but it's not that his sense of safety was actually enhanced by it.
Okay, and let's do maybe one more question, and then we'll wrap up. And Chris or Jobin will tell us who that's going to be.
Celine, you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Some of the students are leaving as we've been watching the chat. So some of the students are leaving because they have to go to other classes or they have.
Ruhena, are you still there?
What about Ruhina?
We're down.
Okay, go ahead, Ruhina. Okay. Your mic.
You're muted.
You're muted. You gotta unmute your mic.
You can unmute them too as a co-host.
We still can't hear you.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just jump in with one final question because we need to wrap anyway. And I think at some point, Sandeep, all my Raider friends are bats and they hang from the ceiling in the daytime and write at night. But we did talk about, we had the process question and so on and so forth. What's your feeling at this point about where your own career will go in this era and what you want to accomplish? I don't want to put you into the COVID Olympics, of course.
I want to learn to make
donut. You feel that your own focus as a journalist, as a radio host, as a human being, do you feel your own focus shifting in any way, or do you feel that, are you longing, like so many of us seem to be longing, to go back to quote unquote normal, whatever that was? And I know that you did address this to some degree in the Earth Breathes piece, but I just wanted to see sort of what your closing thoughts might be there.
I think of course I want to go back to a certain kind of normal that we are used to, because that is the comfort zone. But I also think that we will not really be able to go back to that same normal anymore. You know, it is like something fundamentally has shifted and changed within us and the world around us. I mean, I think it is, we are deluding ourselves in India where if we think that if on the 3rd of May, the lockdown is lifted, we will go back to, you know, our bars, our parties, our dinner parties and things. But I worry after I in fact worry more about the world after the lockdown is lifted than I worry about it now, because then I worry that I can go out and be careless and bring the virus home to infect somebody I love and care about, you know. So in that sense, I am, you know, scared about that world. But career-wise, I think it has also made me think that while I do want to continue to do a lot of the stuff I already do, the radio commentaries for KLW, which is kind of my little bit as a global citizen, I love the fact that I can sit in Calcutta and connect, be, and you know, KLW feels like the little radio station with the world as its backyard, and I'm in that backyard talking to my old home. So I love that connection, and I hope that connection will stay. But as for me, I hope to write another book someday. Another book would be nice.
Well, maybe that's the appropriate way to end this, since, as I mentioned, I have assigned this book called Shut Up and Write. We will all, at least for the moment, shut up and write. And I will end also by reminding everyone, in fact, I think I'm going to see if I can do a share screen on this. I want to remind everyone that this is not the only event in our series. It's not the only event for Foothill College. And if you go to this webpage here, foothill.edu, and you scroll down, you will see all the many amazing events. We are hosting 6 from within my class here, but we've got so many more coming up, and so we finished this week with Sandip Roy. Tomorrow there's a fitness through yoga to meditate. The lecture series will begin again on Tuesday for my class and anyone else who would like to join us, with a special Earth Day, pre-Earth Day edition of API Heritage Month, and our former student from Foothill College, Maria Azanova, will be joining us from, I'm not sure actually where in the world she is yet, she hasn't told me, but she may be joining us live from Mongolia, or live from Siberia, or live from the Bay Area, depending on where she is in the world. And so I just wanted to kind of put a shout out there. We are also posting the archives of these conversations, all of the conversations, on this same website. There's a wonderful library resources page right over here that has links to many of Sandip's works, as well as the other works by other authors that we've been sharing. So Sandip, I want to thank you one last time for once again sharing your voice and your life and your humor and your wisdom with Foothill College. This will not be the last time that I will be breaking into your whatever Facebook chat and saying, could you possibly maybe somehow make time for us? It's really appreciated. Students, this is interesting, since that Sandip's been in radio for a couple decades, since he was 6 years old, like me. This was Sandip's first, I think, ever Zoom.
It was.
And probably not your last. So the one thing that I'm going to predict that's going to change is that this is hardly the last time that you'll have to go on Zoom in order to carry on your career. And you did beautifully, and we all did, and I'm feeling very pretty, and so are we all. But it is something. So I wanted to welcome you into the Zoom era as well. So
thank you. I installed it just for you guys.
I know, and thank you so much. And like I say, like, you can always uninstall and get your money back, but I kind of doubt that this is the last time that you're going to have this happen. Although we don't know where that's going to go to. Will Zoom finally emerge as the winning platform, or will something else come from behind, as we know? So please do join us next week if you're listening in, or tomorrow. at Foothill College. Sandeep, we will definitely have you back. Students, I'm looking forward very much to your tests.